In the novel Autumn's Veil, the protagonist cherishes the essence of fall, with its scent of leaves, apple cider and pumpkin pie evoking nostalgic memories of high school days. Accompanied by his two companions, Sybil and Tabitha, they traverse their picturesque hometown in a red Jeep, enjoying the crisp air and vibrant foliage, setting the stage for new beginnings. Sybil, a noblewoman blending in with her punk-inspired attire, and Tabitha, eager for music and mischief, share laughter and camaraderie. The protagonist, Hank, treats them to a shopping spree, emphasizing their importance in his life and the upcoming event that necessitates their finest appearance. Business is booming, relationships are flourishing, and Hank revels in his success, indulging in spontaneous joy by diving into his luxurious pool, symbolizing the sweetness of his accomplishments and anticipation for more. However, lurking beneath the idyllic surface is a sinister plot involving the king of Lupercalia and an assassination attempt. Hank, armed with knowledge from a decoded notebook, reveals a vampire conspiracy to create a monster intended to assassinate the king during the sacred moon ceremony at Lake Wahaya. Amidst skepticism and resistance from the Lupercalian nobility, Hank races against time to convince the king of the impending danger. The trio embarks on a journey to Lake Wahaya, encountering a village meticulously prepared for the royal visit, its cleanliness a testament to the community's reverence. Their arrival suggests hope amidst the looming threat, with the potential to avert disaster and protect both the king and the kingdom. Interwoven throughout the narrative are moments of warmth, humor, and the everyday magic of friendship, punctuated by the fantastical elements of a world where humans, witches, and supernatural creatures coexist. The novel balances the thrill of unraveling a mystery with the charm of small-town life and the complexities of navigating relationships in extraordinary circumstances. Ultimately, Autumn's Veil is a tale of loyalty, love, and the lengths one will go to protect what they cherish, set against the backdrop of a season that embodies transformation and renewal. It explores themes of trust, sacrifice, and the power of belief in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, all within the enchanting realm of Lupercalia. Chapter 1. For as long as I could remember, there was no scent I loved more than the smell of autumn leaves. It had been a good decade since I was in high school, but the familiar scent of dry foliage crunching underfoot brought me right back to my school days. That, coupled with apple cider and cinnamon donuts, bonfires and pumpkin pie, was a recipe for pure nostalgia. The year might have started in January, but to me, autumn was the time for new beginnings. And who better to share a perfect New Jersey autumn day with than my beautiful companions, Sybil and Tabitha? We zoomed through the reservation in my little red Jeep with no doubt blasting over the speakers. The windows were down and the road was clear. It was a perfect day to cruise through the woods that our little town was so well known for, and moments like this made me proud to show off to the girls where I was from. The scene ahead of us as we zoomed down the main road was something out of a fairy tale, with trees as tall as skyscrapers and leaves of red, gold, and yellow that floated lazily through the crisp air. Despite the sunlight that glared down through the trees, it was still a little bit chilly. "Can we play Just a Girl again?" Tabitha asked from the back seat. I looked over at Sybil, who was in the passenger seat, and the witch shot a smirk back at me. "Tabitha," Sybil replied, "we listened to it 15 times on the way to the fair. I never want to hear that song again." "Fine," Tabitha huffed and sidled into the middle seat so that she was in perfect view in my rearview mirror. "But I'm going to teach one of the bards in Lupercalia to play it." The noblewoman was wearing black leggings that hugged her hips and thighs and accentuated her perfectly tight little ass. Paired with her Lupercalian leather boots, it gave her a kind of punky look that helped her to blend in with the locals. She had foregone her usual billowy Lupercalian blouse for a tartan flannel shirt over a black tank top, a look that had drawn the eye of more than one fellow fairgoer. "There are plenty of other songs," I laughed. "I'm sure you'll hear another tune that you like just as well." "Please, goddess, no," Sybil said and rolled her eyes. "Like you can complain," Tabitha retorted. "You've been doing that silly dance for months." "Ladies," I said, "we're here to have fun." "You're right," Tabitha agreed as she leaned back in her seat. "Sisters first." "Right. Right," Sybil agreed. The two ladies grinned as spiderwebs started, and Tabitha started to sway in her seat. Now that the girls had been traveling back and forth between Jersey and Lupercalia with me for the past few months, they'd accrued an entire new appreciation for rock music, action movies, and even a wardrobe of contemporary and sometimes matching outfits. One place where Sybil and Tabitha diverged was their use of makeup. Sybil preferred to keep her naturally luminous skin untouched, whereas Tabitha had fallen in love with black eyeliner. The noblewoman had quickly learned how to hypnotize almost anyone with perfectly smudged ashy black liner that made her look mysterious on most days and, at the worst of times, kind of deadly. The blonde was a real femme fatale with her shock of near-white hair and dark eyes that made the pink of her cheeks and the plumpness of her lips pop. "Hank, do you think you could slow down a little?" Sybil said in a quiet voice. A moment later, "I'm a little nauseous. I think I might have eaten one too many cider donuts at the fall fair." "You don't say," Tabitha drawled from the back seat. "According to my calculations, you scarfed down exactly 9 of those donuts. No more and no less. So, would you really say that's one too many? Or arguably 7 too many? At least I didn't start screaming bloody murder when the Ferris wheel stopped." "When we were at the top," Sybil replied. "I'm pretty sure everyone at the fair was watching us." I looked into the rearview mirror and saw that Tabitha had turned a beetroot pink. If I hadn't alerted the man who controlled the Ferris wheel, we could have been trapped there forever, the noblewoman insisted. "Hank told you that it would stop to let the other riders off and let new ones on," Sybil said and rolled her eyes. "And no one else was screaming." "Fine, you've got me," Tabitha sniffed. "My one weakness is heights. I can't help it." "A fear of heights isn't that uncommon," I said as I slowed down. "There's even a name for it." I looked quickly at Sybil and hoped she could keep the 9 cider donuts in at least until we reached our destination. We were close, but I could pull over if I had to. There was plenty of room along the side of the road, but I had to make sure I didn't wait too long. It was like being back in college and racing back to the dorm before one of us got sick all over the car seat. Back then it had been a fun while drunk game. Now, however, I definitely didn't want to have to clean any puke out of the Jeep. "Why doesn't that surprise me?" Tabitha sighed. "This world has a word for everything." "I'm glad that I can always rely on you for protection, Tabitha," I added. "Thank you," she sighed. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect us, even if it does quiet an entire fairground." It had been my sister Ava's idea to take the girls to the town fair that took over our local park every autumn. Of course, she'd thought that it would be a novelty because it was a local attraction that was exclusive to our town. Little did she know that the girls were witnessing something beyond their wildest imaginations. Sybil had gorged herself on the delicious snacks that encapsulated the season, whereas Tabitha had revealed a pretty impressive fear of heights. "I will say this," Sybil offered. "You might be scared of heights, but you looked like a true master when you were riding that magic cow." "The mechanical bull?" I laughed. "Yeah, that was insane. I've never seen anyone stay 10 minutes on one of those things, and I'm pretty sure that nobody at the fairground had either. And I definitely don't remember ever hearing people cheer like that." "Thank you," Tabitha replied with a smile. "But I've been riding my whole life, and I've been on more stubborn animals than that mechanical bull. Certainly wasn't going to let it defeat me." Tabitha's ride on the mechanical bull had been not only one of the most impressive feats of stamina that I had ever witnessed, but also one of the sexiest things I had ever seen in my life. I'd pulled my squire in for a long kiss once the operator had finally kicked her off, and I'd happily have done more if we hadn't been surrounded by several thousand people. "Tabitha," I asked when I realized the road forked ahead, "would you check the Maps app and see which way we need to go?" "Of course," the blonde answered and picked up my phone. If I didn't know any better, I never would have guessed that she'd grown up in a palace with no electricity as part of a long lineage of werewolf shifters. Could have passed her on the street and mistaken her for just an average but very hot American girl who was busy on her phone. "Take a right," she said authoritatively. "Oh, and Hank, you got another email notification saying that you've been quoted on a television show again." "I'll tend to that later," I chuckled. "For now, let's just focus on getting to this house." Since I defeated Wenderoth at the Obsidian Temple 2 months ago, life had changed dramatically both in my new home of Lupercalia and my old hometown in Jersey. I'd turned my victory over the vampire into a coffee bean estate in the Lupercalian countryside, or moon beans, as they were known in Lupercalia. The beans from the Lupercalian soil were 1,000 times better than anything grown on Earth, and once I'd convinced my sister to give up on the book side of the store and sell nothing but coffee, we'd made more money in that 2-month period than we had since we'd opened. And the money was just the start. When the New York Times sent one of their most popular food critics to give the Moonbeam Brew a try, he had not only extolled its virtues in one of the most popular newspapers in the country, but he'd also interviewed us about the beans. I'm sure the newspaper had been expecting some story about fair trade beans or some poor village in Africa that I'd saved by buying their one crop, but I'd told them the complete truth. I'd explained that the beans were from a magical kingdom called Lupercalia, where the nobility were werewolves who were sworn to protect the kingdom and its people from things like vampires and cyclops, and when I wasn't working in the shop, I was going on quests to save this kingdom at the behest of the moon goddess. Obviously, nobody believed a word of it. When I told the interviewer, he'd only nodded at me and slurped down cup after cup of the Moonbeam Brew while he jotted notes in a beat-up leather-bound notebook. It was the most far-fetched story I could tell him, but it was also completely true. Even though nobody believed a word of it, it had proven to be one of the best marketing moves of the century practically. Subsequently, the interview went totally viral. People got my picture from the paper and made memes of my face on top of a werewolf body holding a cup of coffee. The coffee cup had morphed into a bunch of different things as the weeks went by, as these memes often do, but I had become a kind of internet seal of approval by then. Whatever I was depicted with was instantly deemed to be high quality or superior in some way to the alternative. And it wasn't just limited to culinary items. My image had been used to promote a series of unfortunate events over the entire Harry Potter series, some obscure Eastern European soft drink I'd never even heard of, and even self-help posters. There was one such poster that said, "The desire to destroy myself" along the top, and beneath that was my werewolf image with a text box that said, "The desire to live my life to the fullest and revel in every moment as it passes me by." It felt like everyone was now using the meme, from well-known brands to old high school friends, and now I was recognized in supermarkets and gas stations as some kind of arbiter of taste, all due to that viral interview. It all felt like a bit much sometimes, but I couldn't argue with the publicity or the money it brought in. Heck, I'd even commented underneath one of the memes early on when I tried to explain that my fur was actually darker and my face morphed into a wolf's. The comment alone had accrued over 200,000 likes. We were the envy of every content creator or branding expert that had reached out to us following the success of our coffee, and we hadn't even had to try. "Are we almost there?" Sybil asked. "I feel like we've been in the car for hours." That's pretty rich coming from someone who traveled everywhere by foot or on horseback before I came around. I smirked. "Tabitha, what's our ETA?" 5 minutes, she smiled. "I have a good feeling about this place. I like how secluded it is already." "It took us a while to get here from the main town," Sybil replied. "That's because I wanted to show you guys the scenic route." I laughed. "You know we're only 15 minutes away from the shop, right? I've been sitting through this car ride for nothing?" Sybil protested and placed a hand over her mouth. "Even after I told you I wasn't feeling well?" "I, for one, think it's been very beautiful," Tabitha purred from the back seat. "Maybe if you'd held off on the donuts, you could have focused more on the beautiful autumn scenery rather than trying not to puke." "I guess you're right," Sybil shrugged. "Come on, guys," I laughed. "Quit the moaning. This is one of our most exciting quests yet. The quest for a new house," Tabitha sang. That was another great perk of the coffee business. With all this money, it didn't make much sense to stay in my tiny rental house. And now that I had Tabitha and Sybil with me, I didn't want us all to be squeezed into my tiny bedroom with all my incredible Hulk-themed paraphernalia. My girls deserved nothing but the best, and luckily I was now in a position where I could give them just that. I was looking for a place with a swimming pool, basement, cinema, billiards room, and all the other modern-day luxuries that the coolest houses had. And of course I'd find a way to sneak some Hulk stuff in there. I was after a life of luxury, but I still had to make my mark in some way. Couldn't just let hordes of cash and internet fame swallow me whole. "Where are the houses?" Sybil asked. "Beyond the trees," I assured her as I took in the dense thicket of trees and shrubs that lined the road. "Is this it?" Sybil asked and pointed toward a large boulder that sat at an intersection with the smaller road. I slowed down and eased to the side, even though there was no one else on the road at the moment. "Pennington Drive," I read. "Looks pretty promising so far." "Hey Tabitha, check the map and see how many homes are on Pennington Drive." "Of course." the blonde said and did some quick thumb work on the phone. Suddenly, she raised her eyebrows, and a surprised look came over her face. And? I asked. Only one, she replied. Number 1 Pennington Drive. I felt a smile spread across my face. Wait, Sybil smiled. Does that mean? Yep, I replied. If we moved here, we'd be the only house on the street. It was crazy to even think about it. I'd spent so many years learning the intimate details of my neighbors' lives, from the schedule for watering the lawn to which kids would have to go to summer school, that I wondered if I could even handle this much privacy. But as I looked at the sign and then at my girls, all I could imagine was how wonderful it would be to live in such isolated and peaceful luxury. We wouldn't have to listen to any more school buses rumbling down the street or leaf blowers all day on Saturday. I was excited as hell. Let's see what the rest of it looks like, I said as I turned up the drive. The pleasant road curved slowly through the trees, and I heard both girls sigh as they drank in the sight of the countryside in autumn. The perfectly smooth pavement made one last turn, and a large iron gate appeared in front of us. It looks like a palace, Sybil gasped, and Tabitha poked her head between us to get a better view. Now, the blonde purred. I think I'll be the judge of that. I did. After all, grow up in a palace. I brought the car to a momentary halt as the 9-foot iron gate started to open by itself. Yep, Tabitha nodded. You're right. This is very much like a palace. Sybil playfully rolled her eyes at Tabitha's expertise, and the two of them broke into a fit of giggles. I could barely keep myself from giggling as well. The whole situation was completely crazy. Never in my dreams did I imagine I'd own a property with a gate, much less a property that came with its own road. I drove forward through the gate down a tree-lined slope, and my heart was racing as the outline of a building came into view. Even from afar it looked massive, and I felt like there was no way this could be my life. How could I be a real potential buyer for this property, and not some kind of prankster who tricked the real estate agent into letting me take a look inside this mansion? Yet here I was, flush with cash and with two beautiful women by my side, ready to make a bid if the house lived up to the agent's claims. The house was a massive colonial that had been built as a vacation estate in 1928 by some stock market guru just before the crash. The man hadn't skimped on its construction, which I'm sure he regretted when the economy had tanked. But the various owners over the years had done their part to maintain and update the property so the white siding and black shutters looked like they could have been installed yesterday, and the two brick extensions that had been added in later years blended seamlessly with the original building. There was even the obligatory brick wall covered in ivy on one of the extensions, and I tried not to grin as I pictured myself trying to climb the vine as a kid. I've never seen grass this green, Sybil said. And so dark. Neither have I, Tabitha said. Is it really that green? Or did they paint it? Oh, it's that green, I assured the pair. And it takes an army of yard guys to keep it looking that good, I'm sure. The pavement gave way to cobblestones, and I spotted a silver SUV parked in front of the house, near the long row of perfectly trimmed shrubs that lined the cobblestone drive on both sides. Looks like the real estate agent is here, I noted. Now remember, we don't want to seem too excited. Just play it cool. Of course, Tabitha replied as I parked next to the SUV. Okay, deep breaths, I urged. We all took deep breaths and then climbed slowly from the car. Once I was in the crisp, perfect air, I closed my eyes for a moment and tried to find my poker face. It was hard, I had to admit, because I had such a good feeling about this place. I can't wait to see inside, Tabitha purred. Me neither, Sybil agreed. And the garden as well. I wonder what types of plants grow here in these woodlands. Oh, Hank, I could explore around here for weeks. Well, you might be in luck, I laughed. I already like the look of this place. I agree, Tabitha nodded. I definitely have a good feeling about this one. Could see myself thriving somewhere this beautiful. So could I agreed. But right now, serious faces on. The witch and the noblewoman both nodded, but even a blind man could have seen the excitement that danced in their eyes. All I could do was sigh and lead the way to the front door. The massive black door swung open as we approached, and a figure stepped out onto the porch. It was a woman no taller than 5.5 feet, with tastefully highlighted blonde hair, a suspiciously perfect tan, and big blue eyes with even bigger eyelashes. She wore an impeccably tailored gray suit, with a single strand of pearls, and when she smiled she nearly blinded us with her dazzlingly white smile. "Egad," Tabitha said quickly under her breath. "Those teeth are so bright. They could wake up a dead man." "Tabby," Sybil giggled. "Not now." Tabitha turned to Sybil and raised an eyebrow. "Sorry," she started. "But what did you just call me?" "Tabby." Sybil blushed and swiped her sleek, dark hair out of her face. "One of the little girls at the fair said it. Her dad won her a big toy cat and she called it a tabby cat." "Tabby cat, eh?" Tabitha sighed and shook her head. "It's not very noble sounding, but I suppose I can live with it. But only from you." The two girls smiled at each other, and I noticed the realtor grin awkwardly as she tried to assess the relationship between them. Oh boy, this was going to be fun. This type of arrangement may have been small potatoes in Lupercalia, but here in New Jersey, well, I'd have to think on my feet, or just fall back on my pre-established weirdo coffee grower character. The realtor held out her hand to shake mine, and I was hit with what felt like a wall of scent. I tried not to sneeze in the agent's face, but my sense of smell was one of those parts of my life that had never been the same after I shifted for the first time. It wasn't as powerful when I was a human as when I was in my great wolf or hybrid form, but by God, it made everything a hell of a lot more potent. Henry, so great to meet you," the agent declared as she wrapped my hand in a death grip. "Please," I replied as I tried to reclaim my hand. "Just call me Hank." "Hank." She shot me another smile with those killer white teeth. "It's a pleasure. I know we've only met over our email exchange, but I'm so excited that I'll get to show you this magnificent property in person. So now that we're all here, I'm Carrie and you girls are." She trailed off and flashed a lower wattage smile at Sybil and Tabitha. The agent clearly knew who had the money in our group, and I was almost tempted to tell her that Tabitha was a noblewoman with an estate of her own and Sybil came from a long line of landowners, just to see how the woman would react. "I'm Sybil of stock," Sybil said, and held her hand out to the woman, who took it and shook it far more briefly. "Sybil noted," Carrie smiled. "A pleasure." "The pleasure's all mine," Sybil responded sweetly, a line she'd clearly picked up from one of the many movies the girls had watched. "I'm Tabitha Blueclaw," Tabitha said regally, and instead of shaking Carrie's hand, she merely nodded her head down as was customary in Lupercalia. "Oh yes." Carrie did an awkward head bow in return as she looked Tabitha up and down. "And so, all of you are looking to live in one property?" Carrie flashed me smile, but I could sense a look of calculation behind it. "Of course," I agreed and refused to offer anything else. If Carrie wanted to believe I was setting up a cult, let her. I had enough cash on hand to buy that property, and at the end of the day that was all the agent cared about. "Well, isn't that fun?" Carrie smiled and shrugged her shoulders. "I know that a lot of people in your generation have, roommates. It's not the type of arrangement we commonly see in this price range per se, but it's always so valuable to learn more about how the market is changing." I looked over at the girls and saw that Sybil was still smiling politely as always, but Tabitha looked slightly dead behind the eyes. "Can we look inside now?" Tabitha asked impatiently. Of course. Carrie shook her head. There was a click as the doorknob turned, and then Carrie pushed the door open, and then stepped inside like she was the owner and not just the agent. She turned to us with another plastic smile as she held her hands out wide. "Welcome," the agent declared. The house was cool and smelled of pine and bergamot, a scent combo I'd recently smelled at my sister's place, so I knew it came from a candle. But I had to admit, it suited the room we just walked into. Beautifully waxed dark heart pinewood served as the floor, broken up only by a pair of Persian rugs I was pretty sure were the real thing. Discreet lighting in the ceiling provided just enough illumination that the place didn't feel like a cave, even though the wall of glass that overlooked the back garden was so far away from us that I couldn't see much about the yard other than a tree and some smears of color. Just to our right, an elegant and understated staircase of the same dark wood wound up to the second floor. There was an arrangement of chairs and a coffee table in front of the glass wall that looked cozy, and a built-in bookshelf along one wall was filled with novels that looked like they had all been read many times and not just placed there to add to the ambience. There was even a stack of jigsaw puzzles on the bottom shelf, and I grinned as I imagined the three of us working on a puzzle. On a cold night while we sipped moonbeam brew and listened to music. Whoever did the staging did a great job. What is that? Tabitha asked as she pointed over our heads. I looked up and saw a metal mobile hanging from the tall ceiling in place of a chandelier. Red circles of various sizes dangled from thin rods that swayed slightly as Carrie closed the door shut behind us. It's a Calder, Carrie replied. An original, not a copy. A what? Tabitha asked. Alexander Calder, the zealous estate agent replied and glanced at me. I'm sure you've seen more of his work in the MoMA. The girls looked at each other and shrugged. Crossed my mind for a second that I'd never actually taken them into Manhattan yet, though we'd had so much fun just in New Jersey that it hadn't crossed my mind. I have, I said in a bored voice as I tried to remember what I had seen at MoMA during a field trip. Had there been a Calder? I like it, Sybil declared. It's soothing. Isn't it just? Carrie replied and smoothed her pants. Well, I'm sure you read all the particulars, but I'll go through it again. The whole property is over 3.5 acres. The house itself is 7,000 square feet. And there are 8 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms. 8 bedrooms, Sybil gasped. What are we going to do with all of them? You can always convert them, Carrie smiled. There's a swimming pool and sauna hut outside with 2 slate patios. It's the perfect house for summer parties and entertaining, and I'm sure your friends will love it. I thought back to the guys I spent most of my spare time with before my Lupercalian adventures. Not that I ever had much spare time, as anyone who has ever tried to run their own business would know. When I wasn't at the shop, I was usually either sleeping or looking up more stock that we would need. Still, I had a few high school buddies that hadn't gotten married and had kids yet. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to play video games with me in this palatial property. As I'm sure you noticed, this is still a heavily forested area, Carrie continued. You are invisible to the outside world once you turn onto the private road. You could, of course, sell off smaller properties for development if you wanted, but still remain tucked away in your private paradise. Now there's a gourmet kitchen. We want to look upstairs, Tabitha interrupted and nudged Sybil, who quickly nodded in agreement. Yep, Sybil said. Can we look upstairs first? Of course, Carrie sighed, apparently convinced that we were indeed some sort of cult. But the agent led the way up the shining and very quiet staircase. She paused when we reached the landing, and a quick look around revealed a hallway lined with rooms, a picture window at the end, and what looked like another staircase. Where does that lead? I asked as I pointed to the far end of the hall. Oh, that's the old servants' staircase, Carrie smiled. It's what the staff used whenever they needed to move between floors. Since it was for the servants, it used to be hidden, but the previous owner opened it up so his kids could make it to the kitchen before their food got cold. It's actually a charming spiral staircase, and it would be easy enough to put a door there if you preferred to hide it again. A secret staircase, Tabitha laughed. This really is like life in the palace. Well, I'm glad you like it, Carrie said as she tried to keep the smile on her face. I can show you the master bedroom if you'd like. I'd love to see it, I replied, and Carrie gestured for me to follow her down the hallway and into a room on the left. Carrie opened the door once we had all gathered behind her, and then she threw the door open with a dramatic flourish. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the brightness, but I had to whistle as I took in the space. It was bright and minimalist, which was the current fashion, but I really found myself drawn to the pale wood floors and the cream-colored walls. A king-sized bed occupied most of one wall, and the large round window behind. The bed made for an amazing headboard. The only dark color in the room was the navy blue blanket on the bed. Best of all, there was a balcony, and even from the door I could see the forest that stretched away into the distance. Bright reds, oranges, and yellows glowed against the crisp blue sky, and I understood why someone had decided not to compete with that. Mind if I take a look? I asked Carrie and gestured to the balcony. Be my guest, she smiled. 3 of the bedrooms have balconies, and I think you'll agree it's quite dramatic. The sliding glass door opened silently, and I stepped into the cool autumn air. I drank in the sense of fall for a moment and then moved to the railing. I started to laugh as I took in the rest of the view, which featured a large in-ground pool that shimmered in the sun. Despite the chill in the air, the slate that lined the pool looked warm, and I could even see one of those robotic sweepers moving along the bottom of the pool. Girls, I called back into the room. I think you're gonna like this. This is lovely, I heard Sybil say from the glass door. You have to come all the way out to get the full effect, I replied. A moment later, both women stepped up next to me. Noblewoman and witch both giggled and then gasped as they took in the perfect water. Our own lake, Tabitha whispered. Well, it's a swimming pool, I replied. You're just supposed to swim in it. It's beautiful, Sybil added as she leaned over the railing. I've never seen water so blue. But what is that thing moving around the bottom? It's the pool cleaner, I replied. It sucks up the leaves and dirt. The girls seemed fascinated with the robot, so I stepped back and let them watch the machine for a moment while I turned my attention back to the woods. There was so much potential here, and I could even imagine Casanova running around the hills with a doggy companion or two. This room offers an excellent view, Carrie noted from the doorway. There's an en-suite bathroom and walk-in closet, of course. All the rooms have also been wired for digital control. You can also listen to music in any of the rooms. It looks promising, I said with a shrug as I turned to the agent. Let's see what the rest looks like. I left Sybil and Tabitha on the balcony while I took in the house-sized bathroom that featured a spa tub, walk-in shower big enough for 3 people, toilet and bidet. I shook my head at the size of the closest and wondered who could own so many clothes, but then I remembered it would be me and 2 women. And even if the girls decided to have rooms of their own, I'd probably need space for my armor and such. Carrie and I checked out some of the other bedrooms and then reclaimed the girls so we could all head for the kitchen. The spiral staircase was carpeted, which made sense if it was primarily used by kids who probably ran up and down. But I liked the idea of hiding it again. It would be an homage of sorts to the palace in Lupercalia. We landed in the kitchen, which had dark butcher block countertops, a breakfast island, and a farmhouse-style sink. The walls were covered in a shock of blue floral wallpaper, which I hadn't expected in such an otherwise modern house. The original owners wanted the kitchen to be as old-fashioned as possible. The estate agent explained when she caught me staring at the oddity. I can see that, I laughed. This is an impressively accurate depiction of a forsythia, Sybil said as she studied the wall decor. The artist must have put a lot of care into it. Well, yes, I suppose, Carrie replied. It's a vintage print, I know that, and they found it when they were in France. They weren't sure there would be enough to cover the kitchen, so the wife was in here every day to make sure the workers didn't waste a single inch. It suits the room, Tabitha said as she wandered around the kitchen. I think so, Carrie replied. Of course I understand if you want to modernize the space, but I think that some of the more quirky parts add character if you will. I mumbled as I looked around the room. Like every other room we'd seen, the kitchen was warm and inviting. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the faint aroma of some meal still hung in the air. A large oak table and matching chairs looked like the perfect place to end the day, and despite the polished shine, I could see the scuff marks that all well-used pieces developed. There was probably a formal dining room somewhere, but this was the place where I could picture us taking our own dinners. Didn't the owners want the furniture? Tabitha asked as she traced a finger over the table. Oh, they have multiple properties, Carrie said airily. Their kids have their own homes now, and my understanding is that the family has removed all of the pieces they wanted to keep. Some pieces obviously are more valuable than others, but the owners are willing to negotiate on the price based on which pieces you might want to keep and those you would rather have removed. It's certainly a lovely property, I said as I scratched my chin. What do you two think? It's beautiful, Sybil replied. I could see us growing old here together. I approve, Tabitha purred. I approve wholeheartedly. Oh my, Carrie smiled politely. And I haven't even shown you the basement. I'm sure it's just as perfect as the rest of it, I smiled. We'll take it. Carrie blushed a deep beetroot color, and Tabitha raised an eyebrow at her. Well, what a charming bunch you are, the agent chuckled. I mean, we've had a few other prospective clients, but none of them have been so enthusiastic as you. Now, I should warn you that an offer was made this morning. I'm sure we can beat the offer, I said. And we'll pay cash. Cash? Carrie spluttered as she looked back and forth between Sybil, Tabitha, and myself. You want to pay for the house in cash? I have the money, I said with a shrug. And I don't see any reason to take out a mortgage. Why deal with a bank if you don't have to? I realized that I'd never sounded like more of a gangster in my life. I was just a coffee guy, not some kind of mafia don. But since all of our beans came from Lupercalia, the only things we were basically spending money on these days were milk and disposable coffee cups. My sister and I already owned the store, so there was no rent to pay. But hell, I was from Jersey, so I could play into the gangster persona a little bit. Well, of course, cash is always acceptable, Carrie said quickly and smiled. In fact, that's the kind of thing that will sweeten the deal for the seller. But just to be clear, we're talking about dollars, right? Not cryptocurrency or such. Good old-fashioned dollars, I assured her. I only use crypto for more unconventional purposes. Well, that didn't sound at all like a hitman. Carrie's plastic smile was back, and I could tell she was trying to decide if I was just a weird cult leader, or if I was part of some criminal organization as well. The fun never ended in New Jersey. Well, once you make your official bid, we can get the ball rolling, Carrie declared. As I said, there was an offer made this morning, so the sooner you can make yours. But I was ready for this. I checked the property values on the surrounding estates, researched recent sales prices, and come up with a number that I thought the owners would be willing to accept, especially since I was paying cash. Do you have a pen and paper? I asked as I patted my pockets. Of course, Carrie replied as she opened her handbag. She dug around through the contents for a moment and then handed me a pen and a small notebook. Here, I said as I wrote my offer on a clean sheet of paper. Call me once you've talked to the sellers. Oh well, she murmured as she studied the very large number I'd written down. Well, I think they'll be very happy. In fact, I might even say, welcome to your new home. Yeah, Sybil cheered. Where are you living now, may I ask? Carrie asked as she tucked everything back into her handbag. I'd be happy to help you find a buyer. Oh, I replied. I've got a small place over on Cedar. Cedar? She asked quizzically as she furrowed her brow. Near the town center? That's Cedar. That's the one, I agreed. I've been there for, let me think, about 8 years now, so it's time for a change. Cedar to this house? She asked in disbelief. Did you win the lottery? You could say that, I laughed. We sell coffee, Sybil added helpfully. Yes, I've had some, Carrie admitted. And it's the best I've ever had. I just had no idea you were selling so much. It's pretty amazing, I replied. Well, Carrie declared and smiled again. What a wonderful success story. We'll pass this along to the sellers, and I expect I'll have an answer for you quickly. Good, I replied. The sooner the better. I'm not sure how much longer we'll be in town, so I'd like to get this done as soon as possible. Of course, Carrie agreed. Are you taking a vacation somewhere exotic? No, Tabitha replied as she opened one of the cupboards. We'll be heading back to the estate. The estate? Carrie asked and glanced at me. Where we grow the coffee beans, I explained. Of course, Carrie blurted out. 2 estates. Well, that's wonderful. Well, we should get out of your hair, I said. And I'm sure you want to call the sellers to discuss the offer. Come on, ladies, we still have a few chores to take care of. We'll need to pick up some more Hulk towels, Sybil teased. No home is complete without them. I laughed, though Carrie looked appalled. The agent recovered quickly and, after a frazzled laugh, she led the way back to the front door. We passed the palatial dining room, a room with nothing but empty bookshelves, and finally ended up in the room with the giant mobile dangling from the ceiling. I took one last look through the glass wall as she fumbled with the keys, and all I could think about was that I could barely believe my luck. Not only did we have our estate in Lupercalia, now we practically had an estate in New Jersey as well. It felt like a dream, and I had to pinch myself to make sure I was really awake. Shall we? Carrie said as she pulled the door open and waved us outside. I look forward to hearing from you, I said as I shook hands with the agent. Again. Keep your phone close, the agent replied. I'm sure you'll get my call soon. I waved as the girls and I started back toward the jeep. Our footsteps rang against the cobblestones, and I lazily kicked a couple of leaves across the stones. Once I unlocked our ride, Sybil hopped into the passenger seat, and Tabitha took her usual spot in the back so that she could be chauffeured around like the nobility she was. There was more than enough space to turn around, and soon we were back on the smooth road beneath the trees. We were all humming with happiness as we reached the main road, and I stopped for a long moment even though there wasn't any traffic. She was interesting, Tabitha purred from the back. I'm pretty sure she thought you were interesting too, I laughed. I'm going to make a garden, Sybil declared. And I'll bet there's loads of mushrooms in these woods as well. We're going to be healthier and fitter than ever. Nothing as good as mushrooms. Oh, and pumpkins. We definitely have to have pumpkins. Tabitha and I both laughed as Sybil started to run through her garden wish list. The witch had already turned what was supposed to be a small kitchen herb garden into a massive affair back in Lupercalia, so there was no telling what she would do with 3 acres and no neighbors. Still, life was good, but I needed to make sure it stayed that way, and that meant a return trip to Lupercalia was in order once we were back at my small house on Cedar Street. Anything you're looking forward to in particular, Tabitha? I called into the back. She shuffled into sight in the rearview mirror. God, she was so hot. She tapped at her chin before obviously having some kind of aha moment. Of course, she smiled into the mirror and searched for my eyes. I'm looking forward to some skinny dipping in that fabulously blue swimming pool with a little, what did you call it? A robot. I thought you'd say something like that, Sybil laughed. I pulled onto Main Street right by the supermarket. In 2 minutes the coffee shop would appear on our left. Oh wow, Sybil said. It really is a lot closer than I realized. Uh-huh, I replied. We're close enough that we can visit the stores whenever we want, but it'll feel like we're the only ones in the world. The shop appeared on our left, and I could see that the last of the customers were leaving for the day, while our new staff members were preparing to close the register. Now that we made so much money, Ava and I decided to act more like owners, so we weren't on the shop floor every day. Instead, we had a fleet of eager high school students who were saving up some extra money for when they went to college the following year or to fund some fun traveling over spring break in the following summer. Another day, another dollar, Sybil sighed. Where'd you learn that phrase? I laughed. When we watched Annie the musical, she said as she smiled back at me. Oh, that was one of my favorite movies, Tabitha sighed. I turned left to take the shortcut back to my old house. I was looking forward to living a new life of luxury in the suburbs, but part of me was going to miss this old place. The one-story, completely average house I'd lived in thus far had formed the embryonic period of my life before Lupercalia came into the picture. I knew that place like the back of my hand, Hulk paraphernalia and all. I pulled into the driveway just as the late afternoon sun was beginning to burn in the sky. If there was one thing that I could rely on here, it was that there was almost always a beautiful sunset, especially in the autumn months. I'll race you, I heard Tabitha say as she dropped from the Jeep. Sybil was out of the Jeep in a flash, but I felt no need to rush. Pulled the key out of the ignition, hopped out at a more leisurely pace, and locked it. Patted my faithful ride on the fender, and then ambled up the drive to the front door. I decided that even though I was going to live in a mansion now, there was no way I was ever getting rid of that old Jeep. You're so slow, Tabitha complained when I finally joined them. Just enjoying the perfect weather. I laughed as I unlocked the door. Do you two have everything ready to go? Are we leaving already? Tabitha pouted as she headed for the kitchen. Yep, I said as I followed the blonde. I have just as much business in Lupercalia as I do here, and I think Charles said something about coming to look at the estate this week. I don't want to miss him if he comes by. We've had such a long month putting everything together, and it'll be good to see a familiar face. Agreed, Sybil said as she followed me into the kitchen. We all stood around and listened to the clock on the wall tick before I broke the silence. So, I started. All right, Tabitha sighed. I guess let's go home. Oh, it's not so bad, Tabitha, Sybil giggled. We can always come back later. This week for the Hallmark movies. Oh gods, I moaned. Not Hallmark movies. Fine, the blonde agreed. Besides, it'll be good to see how Casanova is getting along. Of course it will, Sybil replied. I put my hands on my hips so that the girls could loop their arms through mine. Ready? I asked. The girls shot a look at each other and smiled. Ready, they said in unison. I twisted the ring on my left hand, and the kitchen faded away into blackness, and the strange feeling of being everywhere and nowhere washed over me. At least it had become easier to move between the two worlds with each visit, and soon I felt like I was back at the top of the Ferris wheel, suspended indefinitely while I waited for the world to reform around me. Then I felt a sturdy floor beneath my feet. We were no longer suspended. Between space and time. We were back in Lupercalia. Chapter 2. We were in the main foyer of my new coffee estate, which was quite a sight. The floor was a dark shade of wood, almost black, and the walls were paneled in a matching dark wood. The Lupercalian version of a large chandelier hung over the center of the room, and the candles wedged onto the iron spikes provided a surprising amount of light. Arches led off to other areas of the manor, though we were still in the process of figuring out what to do with all the rooms, and a wide staircase led to the upper floor. The estate reminded me of an old hunting lodge, like something some French king might have had as his summer hideaway. There was even a stag's head over the front door that Charles had kindly donated to our estate. The older knight had told us that he simply had too many in his own home, and one of his wives was getting fed up with there being more dead stags than people in the house. "Smells nice," I said as I took a deep breath. The place had smelled of must and firewood when we'd first moved in, but Sybil had taken to tossing various herbs onto the flames whenever we lit a fire. The pleasant aromas now permeated the house, especially since we'd lit fires almost every night since the end of summer. I heard footsteps and turned to see May, one of the seasonal servants whose family lived on the estate before the king granted me the fiefdom, with a large pile of laundry. Well, it was more accurate to say I saw May's long, gangly legs and wooden clogs and a large pile of laundry. The top half of her body was completely obscured by a basket of burgundy linens. "Oh, Sir Hank," a chirpy voice called out, even though it was muffled by the fabric. "Great to see you're back. How can you see anything?" Tabitha laughed. "I have my ways," the sentient pile of laundry replied as she descended the last few steps. "How's the family, May?" I asked. The pile of laundry made her way over to us as her clogs clacked against the wooden floor. When she stopped, I could see that she had created a slit in the pile so she could see what was in front of her. She smiled at me and I grinned at the freckled high cheekbones and 2 strawberry blonde pigtails that were tied behind her head. "Oh, they're excellent," she replied. "They're more grateful than ever for your employment, Hank. We've never felt so safe on an estate. And to think, our last house was blown to pieces by a mere thunderstorm. The Lord insisted there was no money to rebuild it, but we could use our own money to do so if we wanted to stay. If you hadn't found us, I'm sure we'd be living in a hovel while still tending to that other, well, Lord." "That's great to hear," I smiled. "Well, not the hovel part or any of that. But I'm glad everyone is doing well. And you're looking forward to your apprenticeship." "Oh, of course I am." She smiled again and even managed a little laugh. "Might I add, without sounding rude, that is some of the most peculiar garb I've ever seen in my life. No offense, of course, but I have never seen people who dress that way." "Is that how people dress in New Jersey?" "It is," I agreed as I glanced down at my long-sleeved tee and jeans. She laughed again and then tottered over to her right through to the kitchen, where all of the laundry was washed in large tubs of boiling water. Didn't seem particularly efficient, but since I hadn't figured out how to bring anything modern to Lupercalia, it would have to do. "Can't fit in everywhere," Sybil sighed under her breath as she glanced at her own clothing. "What's this I hear about a strange and wonderful estate?" A familiar voice called from an archway on the left. "Charles!" Sybil nearly shouted as she bounded toward the older knight. Charles, who was in his human form, grinned as the witch wrapped him in a hug, and then he exchanged friendly pats on the back with me. Tabitha added a quick peck on the cheek, all while my friend smiled at the attention that was lavished upon him. I took a seat while the girls pelted him with questions about the court, and, while he tried to answer as best he could, I studied him carefully. He still had his familiar flop of dark hair, but he had grown a beard that had some pleasant gray coming through. He wasn't in complete armor today, but he had black leather leggings and a black suede tunic covered in silver chainmail, which led me to believe that there must be a formal occasion he was dressed for. "Charles, it's so good to see you," I smiled. "Likewise." He nodded and put his hands on his hips. "The place is shaping up beautifully. I'm glad that one of my many stags has found a home on your wall." "I hope you haven't been waiting long?" Tabitha asked. "Not at all," he said. "I've only been here 5 minutes admiring your sitting room." My young pup seemed to obliterate the entire place at least twice a day, so it was remarkable to see what a house looked like that wasn't covered in wooden swords and mud pies. Tabitha snickered. and I could tell that she remembered being such a young and rambunctious kid herself. And you didn't have any trouble getting in? Sybil asked. No trouble, Charles smiled. One of your kind servants May let me in. Ah yes, I said. May is going to start her apprenticeship as a seamstress in a month or so. She's a very talented embroiderer, but for now she's helping with the laundry. Good embroiderers are hard to come by, Charles nodded. That's one skill you certainly can't inherit. It's always good when you find a peasant with some extraordinary talent. I agree, Tabitha purred, and shot a look over at Sybil, who blushed a cherry red. Oh stop, Sybil waved her hand. Sybil, Charles turned to the young witch. I hear you've made quite the developments in your garden. If you have the time, I'd love to take a look at what you're growing. A huge smile stretched across Sybil's beautiful glowing face. There was nothing in the world she loved more than introducing people to all her plants and seedlings, even more so when that someone was someone she respected. I'd be more than happy to show you all my treasures, she said. I have many rare plants and even some from New Jersey. In fact, I added quickly before Charles could ask how she had acquired plants from New Jersey. I'd be more than happy to give you a grand tour of the entire place if that isn't taking too much of your time, of course. What else am I here for? Charles laughed and shrugged his shoulders. Night won't fall for another hour at least. Wonderful, I replied. If you don't mind, Tabitha interrupted in a sly voice, I think I'd like to retire to our quarters to change back into some Lupercalian clothing and do some reading. I've had quite a long and tiring day, and I don't want to get too exhausted before the evening entertainment begins. Of course, Sybil agreed with a wicked smile. After all, you've really reached some new heights today. Tabitha turned bright pink before making a polite nod at Charles, and then she bounded up the stairs back to our quarters. It's so good to see Tabitha in an environment that suits her, Charles said. Her reputation in the court has improved tremendously due to her association with you. I can tell you for a fact that Blueclaw has never been as grateful in his life. Well, that's certainly a relief, I said. I think Tabitha just needed something a little more outside the box. I saw Charles look at Sybil and I a little more intently. You know, he said, not to sound rude, but what I overheard that servant saying isn't all incorrect. That's some of the strangest clothing I've ever seen on anyone, other than that shirt you were wearing when I found you at the side of the road. I thought back to the Hulk shirt, which nobody had been able to comprehend for some reason. Today I was just wearing a plain blue shirt and a pair of jeans. Well, Sybil shrugged. As I said earlier, you can't fit in everywhere. And the clothing is comfortable, I added with a smile. Indeed, Charles murmured, and I could see 1,000 questions pass through his mind before he finally shrugged. But garb aside, let's get on to more interesting things. I want to see this garden of yours as well as the peasants' quarters. I hear you have the finest in Lupercalia. In fact, I hear they're so nice that some of the other lords have lost their workforce to you. There's been a lot of grumbling at court about that. Oh, just you wait, I replied with a smile as I headed toward the front door. I pushed the front door open and was hit with one of my new favorite smells in the world, moonbeans. The whole outside of the estate stank of them, but I wasn't complaining. Hell, I don't think anyone was. In comparison to tending pigs or making bonfires, I thought the smell was pretty great. But of course things like this crossed my mind. After all, I was a wolf now. This place is glorious, I declared as I stepped outside with Sybil and Charles right behind me. It's a lovely piece of land, Charles agreed as he took a deep breath. In front of me stretched the cobblestone passage that led to the gate for my estate, and beyond that I could just make out the village of Stock. The palace was just a few miles beyond that, and on a really clear day I could make out the tops of the towers. In between our house and the gate was Sybil's medicinal garden and a small hut for her to conduct her research and carry out experiments with the things she grew. The hut was round and had a thatched roof, and in fact it looked a lot like the hut I'd stayed in when I first met her. To our right was a little over an acre of moonbean bushes, though the fields where the beans grew extended behind the manor house. There was also a small village that I had built for the people who would live and work on the estate, tucked away behind the acres of beans, which had become a source of contention with those lords who didn't see the need to provide decent housing for their workers. Enclosed by a wall to protect the beans, land, and peasants from thieves and brigands, There was another wrought iron gate at the back of the property, but the people who lived there kept a careful eye on the 20-foot gate. What a beauty, Charles sighed and shook his head. To think this has only been up and running for how long again? 2 months, I smiled. Shall we look at the garden? Sybil motioned for us to follow her, and we headed up to the right. We got about halfway to the garden when I heard a friendly bark from behind us. It was Casanova. Gangway! I shouted at the others and everyone turned back around. Casanova, who was now an adolescent pup, was about 7 feet in length and 4 feet in height, however, he still had the coordination of a puppy. The giant black ball of fur torpedoed straight at us, before jumping up and placing his paws on Charles's shoulders. Hello, Casanova. Charles stuttered under the weight of the giant puppy. It's such a pleasure to see how much you've grown. Down, boy. Sybil snapped her fingers at the ground, and Casanova obediently retreated and rubbed his big furry head in her soft hands. My. Charles laughed and gave him a friendly rub on the back. I always forget just how quickly they grow. Yep, I nodded. We've only just started riding him. That's still very impressive after only 2 months, Charles nodded. Well, yes, Sybil shrugged. He can only get to the castle and back at this point, but it's a good start. He knows where his home is, and that's the most important thing for a direwolf his age. That's absolutely right, Charles nodded. Casanova licked Charles's hand, but quickly became distracted by something near the house. He ignored all of us as his ears twitched, and he prepared to bound after something. What is it, boy? I asked and ruffled the fur between his ears while I scanned for squirrels. But rather than a small rodent, I saw a young peasant boy run around the corner of the manor with a large stick in his hand. Puppy! The boy cried out happily as he waved the stick in the air. We watched as Casanova bounded over to the boy and licked his face. The sandy-haired boy, who was dressed in a canvas tunic and cotton leggings, laughed and laughed. It seems like he's adjusting to life on the estate very well, Charles said. Some direwolves get very aloof around other people, especially redbloods, and stick to their quarters. I don't think that's going to be a problem, I replied. Which is good since you're a redblood, Charles added with a wink. I guess I'll never live that down, I laughed. We turned back around, and Sybil led us over to the medicinal garden. I must say, Charles said, all of the peasants on this estate seem to be happy. That's not the case for a lot of the nobles here in Lupercalia, you know. That was very important to us, Sybil replied as we reached her hut. We designed the houses ourselves and ensured that they were double insulated and fire-resistant as much as possible. These are some of the only houses on an estate that have stone floors and multiple rooms, which also means that it doesn't get too hot in the summer nor too cold in the winter. Is this true? Charles turned to me. Yep, I said. The whole reason I ended up in Lupercalia was because I ended up trying to save some kids from a burning house. I know that sometimes landlords take advantage of their tenants, and I wanted to make sure that everyone who was working for me was well cared for. Huh, Charles mumbled as he watched the boy and the direwolf for a moment. Where Hank is from, you can work for your own wealth, Sybil said. You don't have to stay in the same social station all your life like in Lupercalia. So we decided that the peasants can also have a higher cut of the beans they're harvesting, and one day they'll be able to buy their own land or shop or whatever they want to do with the money. Really? Charles asked in shock. And what cut is that? We raised it from the usual 12% to 15%, I replied. We needed people to move here quickly, and it was one of the most attractive offers we could make to young families. Plus, we're still turning a tremendous profit from what we make back in Jersey, so that extra 3% doesn't make too much of a difference to me. You're an incredibly moral businessman, Hank, Charles said and shook his head. I wish all of the nobles in Lupercalia were like you. Oh, Charles, Sybil sighed. You know you're a good man as well. You've helped more citizens of Stock than I can count. Remember that time our fence broke and the pigs got loose in the forest? You came in on Birdie and helped to wrangle them yourself. For the first time since I'd met the older knight, I saw Charles blush. Stop it. He waved his hand gracefully. It's the job I was born into. As in my blood. The people of Stock are my charges, and it's my pleasure to serve them, especially when they turn out to be so magically talented as our young Sybil here. Just wait until you see what I have growing, she replied. She opened the little gate in the cute wooden fence that marked off her garden. There were several herbs and other plants that I could recognize, like parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, cardamom, chives, and dill. There was also rhubarb, a blackberry bush, and even a few potatoes growing. But then there were things I didn't recognize at all. Sybil had been ordering rare seeds from a depot in LA that would then FedEx the order to New Jersey. Think one of the things she was growing was some new variety of weed, but I couldn't be sure. She had spent a week treating different types of soils, and this was evident from their shades of darkness. I'd never met anyone with a green thumb like hers. Right now, I'm working on lotus root, she said. It's got medicinal and anti-inflammatory qualities that rival a lot of the plants you can find in Lupercalia. But that's not all. Come in here. She gestured to her wooden hut and then led us inside. It had a surprisingly high ceiling for what looked like such a small hut from the outside. Just like her old one, flowers and herbs were hung from the high ceiling rafters to dry. I saw dried roses, lavender, and even a few leaves. There were also twirling roots and flowers that I couldn't identify in their dried state. Want to see what I'm working on right now? She asked both of us. I'm already lost. Charles laughed slightly uncomfortably. But of course. I'd love to see it. She went over to the far end of the hut, and I saw that there was a dark curtain. She gestured for us both to come over, and Charles and I shot each other a look. This seems like some heavy-duty stuff, Sybil, I said. It's what I was telling you about the other day, she said. She lifted the curtain, and I could see an array of plants growing in the dark. They were spindly, long, and completely white. When you deprive plants of the sun, they obviously don't get chlorophyll. She explained, as if I could remember this stuff from my 9th grade biology class. That means they lose their color. But bear in mind that Lupercalians have a particular relationship with the night and the dark. You don't mean? Charles started to say and then glanced at me. Yep, she said. I'm dealing in alchemy at the moment. Hank kindly lent me some of his silver. Only 1 bar, barely enough to make a difference to his finances, but it's more than enough to set off a chemical reaction that imbues a young witch like me with certain abilities. Abilities? Charles laughed. And what might those be? Sybil closed the curtain and smiled while Charles and I exchanged another worried look. Try and open that book, she commanded. She pointed to a heavy leather-bound notebook that was sitting on a small wooden table near where Charles was standing. I had a feeling I knew what was coming next, but I only shrugged when the knight looked at me. Open a book, he sighed. Charles took the book in his hand, and Sybil immediately pointed at him. The book splayed open by itself, and all of the pages started fluttering on their own accord before he dropped it. Holy shit. She wasn't joking when she said she was working on petty hexes. Actually worked. Can I? Charles gestured at the book on the floor. Can I pick it up now? Don't want to leave your book on the floor. Of course. She threw her head back and laughed. I had never found her so sexy before as I did in that moment. I realized she was a young witch in the full flush of her power, and I had a feeling I'd only seen the barest hint of what she could do. Charles bent over and picked up the book, which he placed politely back on the table. Sybil, he said, that was an extraordinary display of your prowess as a witch. But what is the need for such a skill? I travel with a knight and warrior on quests, Sybil replied. But I don't have the same combat instincts or training, so I thought I should work on the skills I do have. I want to be able to help in battle, and I want to be able to protect myself too. Charles nodded wordlessly. He was obviously impressed, and he wasn't the only one. If I could have taken Sybil right then and there, I would have. There was nothing that turned me on more than watching my women use their skills. Couldn't believe that she'd gone from her potions to being able to turn a hex on someone within only the span of 2 months. If you ask me, the 3 of us were working our way to being impossible to defeat. And something was telling me that that was exactly what we'd need. I looked over to the leather-bound book that Charles had placed back on the shelf. It reminded me of another journal I'd come across only 2 months ago. Winderoth's notebook. I'd been having dreams about his last words to me in the Obsidian Temple. He'd told me with such conviction that this was only the beginning that I couldn't quite shake it out of my head. I'd kept the notebook itself close to me until we moved into the estate, where it stayed in my loot box out of the view of the servants and even the girls. I knew I had to tell someone about the vampire's claims at some point. But what would I tell them? That I had an encrypted diary that I couldn't read, but the big bad vampire had warned me that there was something more evil on the way. I knew the other knights would just brush it off as the usual vampire nonsense, but the truth was Wenderoth had seemed a lot smarter than I'd been led to believe. Hank, Charles called out gently. I heard his voice echo around my head, and when I looked up I gasped. Everything okay, Hank? Sybil asked in concern. She lifted her eyebrows and put a pot of some rare herb that she was showing Charles back on the floor. Sorry about that. I laughed as I shook myself like a dog. It's been a long day. I think I just zoned out a little bit. Do you want me to make you some tea? Sybil offered. I have some rhodiola growing that I could whip up for you. That's fine, Sybil, I said and smiled. But thanks all the same. Think I just got a little bit distracted thinking about everything on the estate that we still have to do. It's a lot of impressive work you're doing, Hank. Charles patted me on the back. I'd be exhausted too if I were you. Sybil turned around, and I saw her grab one of her little bottles of oils that she extracted herself. She pulled out a handkerchief from a small wooden drawer and dabbed some of the oil on it. Here, she said as she turned around and handed me the handkerchief. This will help. I scowled at the piece of fabric before I accepted it. Most of Sybil's concoctions smelled good, but there'd been a few recently that had left me holding my nose and running from the room. Don't worry, she giggled. It's just peppermint. I'm not going to try any experiments on you. Thanks, I replied as I held the handkerchief to my nose. I breathed in deeply and closed my eyes as I felt my body respond to the vibrant scent. I immediately felt more bright and alert, and the oil was so pure that it even stung the tip of my nose a little bit. It's incredible that you've managed to experiment so much and grow so many plants in such a short amount of time, Charles said to Sybil. Here, try this, I said as I handed him the handkerchief. Refreshing, right? Sybil smiled as the older knight took a quick sniff. Very, he agreed, took a deeper breath and then returned the cloth to the witch. Do you have a secret for how to accomplish so much in such a short amount of time? Well, Sybil trailed off and looked up at the ceiling thoughtfully. I suppose there are some tricks I've been experimenting with lately that help me cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time, but they're not perfected yet. Plus, if I told you, it wouldn't be a secret. She smiled a sly smile and placed the handkerchief back in the drawer. Are you experimenting with more magic, Sybil? I asked. When it's ready, you'll see, she replied and then gestured for us to follow her out of the hut. Let's go back outside. I want to catch some sunlight before the end of the day. Of course, Charles said as he held the door open. We stepped outside into the early evening light, which had turned a dark orange while we'd been in Sybil's lab. The sky was streaked with cotton candy, pink clouds, and in the distance I saw the light reflecting over the roofs of stock. What a beautiful kingdom, Charles declared as he sniffed the air. Ah, this place smells amazing. I love the smell of moonbeam brew in the morning, but you have it all hours of the day. It's true, I laughed. I think we might have the best smelling farm in the kingdom, which is quite a feat. You're telling me, Sybil said as she closed the door of her hut behind us. I got so used to the smell of pig shit that I didn't even smell it anymore. I can say the same about the horse barn on my estate, Charles replied. Would you like to see the peasant houses now? I asked. I'd love nothing more, he sighed. But I should be leaving soon. I have to get to the palace, and so do you. I exchanged a confused glance with Sybil and then looked back at Charles. Really? I asked. I didn't know anything special was happening tonight. Don't think we received an invitation or anything. Ah. His face lit up. Then what a wonderful surprise it will be. Tonight marks the beginning of one of the most sacred holidays in Lupercalia, at least for the nobility. The king is starting his annual voyage to the sacred lake, and we always kick off the journey with a great banquet. A banquet? Sybil's eyes widened, and I could tell that she'd somehow gotten over the 9 cider donuts that she'd practically inhaled back in Jersey. Sounds perfect. Indeed, Charles replied and nodded his head. And what's more, all knights are expected to be present. So, will I be seeing you at the palace tonight? You sure will, I said. Chapter 3. It was great to see you today, I said as I patted Charles on the shoulders. And I'm glad you like my estate. Great things indeed. We'll see you soon, I laughed. Just as soon as I can round up some clean clothes. Charles laughed as he started to saunter toward the front gate. He stayed in his human form, so he was soon little more than a speck on the road. You thinking what I'm thinking? I asked Sybil when the night was out of sight. Tabitha, Sybil suggested. I'm surprised she didn't tell us about this big celebration, I said as we turned back to the house. Since it's supposed to be so important and all. She has spent a lifetime trying not to blend in, Sybil replied. I'm glad Charles warned us, I said. I'd hate to be on the outs with the king just because we missed this big trip or whatever it is. I suspect he would forgive you, Sybil said as I opened the door and waved her inside. It's the other nobles who would probably complain. That's true, I admitted. Well, Sybil said as she walked toward the stairs, I'll just go find a nice dress to put on. At least I don't have to worry about wearing armor for every special occasion. Well, lucky you, I said, but as she started to head to the stairs I ran up behind her, took her by the waist, and lifted her over my shoulder. Hank, she protested. What? I laughed and adjusted her slightly so that her weight was evenly distributed over both shoulders. You're the one getting a free ride. I guess, she sighed. You know, I could get used to being carried around like this. That's the spirit, I said. I got to the top of the stairs and turned right toward our bedroom. Tabitha had her own quarters as well, but she insisted that my bed was the most comfortable in the whole manor, so she hadn't used her own bed even once. Not that I was complaining. The door to my private quarters was a heavy piece of oak that had my coat of arms carved into it. It still blew my mind how quickly the artists of Lupercalia had been able to create the thing, and I didn't think I'd ever adjust no matter how long I stayed. Tabitha, I called as I knocked on the door. Tabitha, are you awake? I heard someone shuffling around the room, so I knelt down and plopped Sybil back on the floor. I'm not awake, a grumpy voice came from inside my room. So go away. She always does this, Sybil sighed and turned the doorknob. The dark blue velvet curtains had been pulled over the windows on the far side of the room, so the place was barely lit when I stepped inside. The only thing I could see clearly was Tabitha, who was sprawled glamorously across our massive four-poster bed. Oh, Tabitha, I sighed playfully and went over to sit on the foot of the bed. What is it? The noblewoman asked without opening her eyes, and I noticed that her eyeliner was already smudged from her usual tossing and turning. Nap time's over, Tabby cat, Sybil said and flung the curtains open. I need my beauty sleep, Tabitha wailed as she pulled a pillow over her face. It's time to go to the palace, I said. Come on, put on your finest attire. Apparently, the king has an important announcement about a sacred lake. Tabitha shot up and looked around the room. Then she patted her platinum blonde hair and squinted through the window. Is it really that time of year already? She croaked. How could I have forgotten something so important? She hopped out of bed and pulled the massive quilt back over the pillow in a single lazy motion. That's what I thought, Sybil laughed. Luckily, Charles stopped by to tell us that we were expected to be there tonight. I thought you were supposed to be our insider for everything to do with the Lupercalian nobility. I am, Tabitha insisted and shrugged her shoulders. But I must have gotten too distracted with all the business on the estate and in New Jersey. This is my first time living outside of the palace since I was a pup, so I haven't been paying much attention to all that. Let's go choose something to wear, Sybil suggested, and you can fill me in on this sacred lake. Ugh, fine, the blonde replied. I noticed that the noblewoman didn't complain anymore, though, as the witch tugged the blonde toward the walk-in closet. Of course, the manor hadn't come with a walk-in closet, but the two women had acquired so much clothing between Lupercalia and New Jersey that we changed one of the rooms into their closet. Right? I sighed and pulled off my own clothing. It was time to get into night mode. I went over to my wardrobe and pulled out a pair of gray suede pants and a gray suede shirt. I pulled them on and then slid the chainmail over my comparably lighter and softer clothing. I grabbed my pair of black leather boots and pulled those on as well, since I'd quickly discovered that trying to put on shoes after I'd slid on my armor was almost impossible. Once I had my bottom layers on, I crossed the room to the wooden mannequin that held my armor. Since we were simply going to the palace for a feast, rather than heading out on a quest, I would only have to wear the leg pieces, sleeves and breastplate. The mirror in my room was large but slightly warped. The girls had talked about replacing it, but I kind of liked the slight funhouse effect, so it stayed. Even now, I had to chuckle as I took in the narrow waist and long face that the glass gave me. But aside from the silly distortions, I liked what I saw. I looked official, but not too over the top. And luckily, Ava had given me a haircut back in Jersey like she used to do when we were in high school. I looked like one handsome wolf. I heard a knock on my door and turned around. I smiled as I saw the two most beautiful women I'd ever seen come toward me. Like our outfits? Sybil practically sang. Sybil was wearing a typical long emerald green dress with wide sleeves, but unlike the casual ones that she used for gardening and tending to her potions, this one had golden vines embroidered on the fabric. It gave the illusion that the vines were growing up her slender body, while the tight fit emphasized her soft curves and long arms. Tabitha, on the other hand, was wearing an electric blue suede bodysuit which clung to her hips and ass like a glove, pointy red boots that looked very medieval, and a red tunic-like shirt that was as tight as a corset at her waist. It should have looked ridiculous, but the noblewoman pulled it off. "Before you tell me that I look like a jester," Tabitha started, "I want to tell you that I don't care. I like how blue and red look together, and nobody is going to convince me to stop wearing them together." "I wasn't going to say that at all," I replied. "I was going to tell you both that you look amazing. How'd I get so lucky?" Both of the girls blushed, and Sybil swept her hair behind her ear. "Oh, Hank," the witch giggled. "Flatterer," Tabitha said cheekily and came over to me. Then she gave me a soft, sensuous kiss under my ear that sent a shiver down my body and made my cock twitch slightly. "I know you love it," I growled and slapped her on her soft ass. "But first, we should hear what the king has to say. Then we can have some fun." "Promise," the blonde growled. "Promise," I replied. "How are we getting to the banquet tonight?" Sybil asked as we headed for the staircase. "Casanova," I said. "He needs the training, and since he already knows his way there, we won't have to waste a lot of time trying to direct him. Unless he gets distracted," Tabitha sighed. "Which he surely will." "Another reason he needs training," I said. "And this really is a good time to do it. And if we're late, we can just blame it on our wandering pup," Sybil laughed. "There is that," I agreed. When I swung the front door open, I saw that the sky was beginning to dim into a dark blue shade and the clouds had dissipated into a nice mist. It would be perfect conditions for the trip to the palace. "Beautiful day," Tabitha mumbled as she closed the door behind us. We strolled along the front of the house and then turned the corner into one of my favorite spots on the property. It wasn't much to look at, just a decent-sized lawn and a couple of shade trees, but it always seemed warm and the sunshine just a little brighter on that patch of grass. And as I'd suspected, Casanova was there, in his preferred bit of shade under one of the trees. He was watching a couple of kids chase each other around with sticks while they pretended to be knights, pirates, or possibly some combination of both. "Oh," Sybil sighed. I waved at the kids, who waved back and smiled. Then I made my way over to Casanova. "Come on, boy." I smiled and clapped my hands. "We're going to visit the king, so you can visit your brothers and sisters." The giant black fluffy ball sprang up and panted up at me. I looked into his bright blue eyes, and he gave me a satisfying lick on my hand. "Where's his harness?" Tabitha asked. "I have it in my shed," Sybil said. We walked back to Sybil's shed while Casanova dutifully followed us. He padded behind us, though sometimes he would bolt ahead to chase a butterfly or dart off into the shrubs after a squirrel. He was a good pup, but he definitely needed to learn how to behave when he was supposed to be on the job. Sybil ran into her little hut, and I heard her rummaging around for several minutes. When she reappeared, she had the direwolf-sized harness in her hand. Unlike the ones they use for horses, the direwolf harnesses didn't have a bit. Instead, they went over the neck and under their belly and fastened on their back. "When do you think you'll get a real saddle for him?" Tabitha asked as we watched Sybil fasten the harness around a patient Casanova. "When he's been trained to joust," I replied. "At least that's what Charles recommended. He needs to learn navigation and then sport. But I think for short journeys like this it makes sense to go bareback. Charles said it will make it easier for him to adjust to the extra weight on his back, especially if all three of us are going to be riding him together." Sybil finished fastening the harness around Casanova's torso and led him to a nice job, Tabitha nodded. I know a few lords who still can't put the harness on themselves. Thanks, Sybil smiled. It helps that Casanova's very patient. There's a lot more to it than that, Tabitha replied. Trust me. Sybil ducked her head, but I knew she was pleased by the compliment. I winked at Tabitha, took the reins and led the way to the main gate. Since it would be dark soon, I knew the gatekeeper would be by soon to lock the gate for the night, so I pulled out my own copy of the key and locked it behind us. Truthfully, I'd sort of wanted my own mode as well because heck, it was a castle, but everyone had assured me that a knight's estate didn't require such measures. One day, though, I knew I would have one built. Okay, boy, I said as I climbed onto Casanova's back. Remember to wait until I give you the command. Casanova pawed the ground, but at least he didn't try to bolt away like he had the first couple of times we tried to ride him. He hadn't been spooked or anything, just ready to run and not at all concerned whether everyone was on board and safely seated. Tabitha climbed on next, followed quickly by Sybil. When everyone was settled, Tabitha poked me with one of the hands she had locked around my waist. I took a deep breath and took a quick glance over my shoulder just to be sure everyone was holding on. I loved my pup, but I had to admit his running style so far had been bumpy, and if legs and arms weren't secure, people tended to fly off. Good thing I'm in the middle, Tabitha chuckled. You saw me on that magic cow at the fairground. I can stay on anything. Just keep your arms locked around me and you'll be fine, Sybil. Yep, Sybil squeaked from the back. The last time we had ridden Casanova, the witch had insisted on a turn at the reins. She had lost control immediately, been bucked off as Casanova had chased after a rabbit, and almost accidentally trampled within a matter of seconds. Here we go, I warned as I nudged Casanova forward with my knees. The pup tensed beneath me, and before I could stop him, he reared up like the Lone Ranger's horse. It was great for me, but I heard Sybil gasp and felt Tabitha's arms tighten around my torso. But as quickly as he'd stood up, the puppy returned to all 4 feet and started to race down the track. Since he was only 3 months old, he still had the goofy gait of a puppy, even though he was nearly as powerful as an adult direwolf. His feet, which were still too big for his body, carried us in a gait that was somewhere between an enthusiastic canter and a bouncy gallop. It was not a comfortable ride, but my only consolation was the repeated assurances from Charles that the pup would grow into his body and the ride would become much easier. Can we go any faster? Tabitha yelled as we zoomed over the green Lupercalian fields and up the misty hills to the castle. Are you crazy? Sybil shouted back. It felt like we were on a rocky boat. We swayed from side to side sometimes, all sliding uncomfortably to the left and sometimes to the right as Casanova hurtled himself toward the palace. It was like riding a bumper car. I gave Casanova another light nudge, and the pup opened up his stride. But Tabitha was right. The faster pace smoothed out the direwolf's gait, and suddenly we were no longer bouncing around like pinballs. Woo! Tabitha yelled. I was really starting to enjoy the run, so I was disappointed when the castle appeared out of the mist. I could see that the drawbridge was down, and several other knights on direwolves were already crossing the moat. We were racing so fast that I knew we were in danger of crashing into the other direwolves, so I pulled back slightly on the reins to slow Casanova down. But my pup was too excited, and he kept hurtling toward the drawbridge, like his life depended on it. Oh, I mumbled as the bridge loomed before us. Hank! Tabitha yelled. Do something. 2 knights who were crossing the bridge heard her cry and turned to look over their shoulders. Their eyes widened in shock at the sight of Casanova bearing down on them, and I heard the gray direwolf growl in alarm. I pulled back as hard as I could on the reins, and Casanova reared up until he was nearly vertical. Try as I might, I couldn't hang on, and one by one the 3 of us slipped off the direwolf's back. I crash-landed on the wooden drawbridge, and my ears rang as silver clattered against wood. I immediately looked behind me to check if Tabitha and Sybil were okay, but luckily they both appeared unharmed. You all right? I asked the girls. Yes, Sybil said as she stood up. I was right at the back, so I actually had barely any distance to fall. And this was nothing compared to some of the tumbles I've taken from a horse, Tabitha replied as she brushed dirt from her leggings. Okay, I said as I climbed to my feet. But I have got to work on commands. With him, Casanova. I expected the black ball of fur to run toward me, but all I got was a soft whine. When I looked around, I realized that one of the knights had grabbed Casanova's reins and was giving him a pat on the head. The man's own direwolf was standing patiently between the palace guards, though it was giving Casanova one of those exasperated looks that all adults seem to have. "I'm so sorry about that," I said as I started to walk toward the knight. "I've been working with him, but he gets excited about coming here." "Don't apologize," the knight replied. "It's not every day I get to hold the reins of a royal direwolf." "George," I called out happily when I recognized the voice. "I haven't seen you since the joust." "Henry," he bowed his head. "A pleasure to see you once again. It's been too long." "Hello, George," Tabitha called over and waved. "Hello, Miss Blueclaw." He bowed his head again. "It's an honor to gather with you all on this sacred feast day, and the little puppy who I met only 2 months ago has certainly grown into a bigger puppy," I laughed. "But a puppy nonetheless." "It's good you're riding him this early," George replied. "Once you get past the first hiccups, they're as right as rain." He handed me Casanova's reins, and then the 4 of us walked across the bridge together with Casanova trotting quietly behind. The sandy-haired direwolf sniffed at Casanova and then joined us as we stepped into the main courtyard. The place was busy, and it was a quest in itself just to avoid getting trampled. "This is crazy," Sybil said as she narrowly avoided getting her foot stomped on by an unruly horse. "It's always like this," Tabitha sighed. "I'd almost rather go to the stables with the direwolves than head upstairs." "My lord," Dromgoole the squire cried out as he ran up to George and took his direwolf's reins. "Hey, Dromgoole," I said. The little squire looked up at me with his eyebrows raised, and then made a quick curt bow. He was dressed in a navy blue and checkered tunic, dark blue leggings, and a white floppy hat, all of which probably had some connection to the night's events, but I wasn't sure what that was. "An honor, Sir Henry," he said. "I'm sorry I can't stop to chat like we usually do, but it's a very busy night for us squires." "Of course," I replied. Dromgoole tugged on the reins while a second squire stepped up to me. The new guy looked a lot like Dromgoole, though I didn't remember him from any of my other visits. "Evening," the young squire said in a nasally voice. "You are Henry the baker?" Yeah," I said. "Marvelous," the squire said as he took Casanova's reins. "We'll take good care of him, Sir Knight." "Thanks," I muttered, but the squire was already out of earshot. "This is one of my favorite times of the year," Tabitha murmured. "I thought you wanted to stay in the barn?" I teased as we joined the line of people heading up the grand marble staircase. "Well, that's just to get away from all the people," the blonde replied. "If it wasn't so packed full of people giving me the side eye for being different, it would be the best holiday, hands down." "What's going on?" Sybil whispered to the blue-blooded noble. "I heard something about a sacred lake." "Just watch," Tabitha said softly as we filed through the small hallway with the rosette window. "I can explain, but the king always does a better job." We walked through the great wooden door, which had been propped open in order to accommodate the unusually large influx of people. I was immediately hit with a wave of heat. The place was not only lit by multiple flaming torches, but there were more people than I'd ever seen in the dining hall before. "Whoa," Sybil said as she looked around the place. "And there are still people on the way," Tabitha said. The other guests were heading off to visit friends and relatives, but I wasn't sure where we were supposed to go. I couldn't see anyone else I recognized, at least none that I wanted to socialize with, but we couldn't just stand in the doorway all night either. We inched into the room until we were at least out of the flow of people, and I looked around the great hall to see what had changed. Like the outfits of the squires, the decorations often reflected the event of the day, and today was no different. The floor had been covered in an electric blue carpet with white swirls that looked like ripples moving across water. The walls had been covered in thin, matching blue pieces of fabric that hung down gracefully from the rafters, and even the tapestry which hung behind the throne had been covered in an almost paper-thin blue fabric. The familiar scene of the moon goddess saving Lupercalia was still there, but it was washed over with a silvery blue tint. I felt like I was underwater. "This way, please," a high-pitched voice said, and I looked down to see Sebastian. "Sebastian," Tabitha greeted him. It's been a while since I've seen you. Miss Blueclaw. He bowed very low and then stood back up. What an honor to find you back in the palace. You will all be sitting at the Blueclaw family table tonight, of course. I'm pleased to tell you that your family will be sharing a table with the Greybacks. It's traditional for the members of the noble families to sit together on this night, Tabitha explained. You'll be able to meet my parents and my cousins. And you know old Greyback and Hector, I sighed. Don't get me wrong, I have all the time in the world for Greyback, but then don't worry, Sybil said and took my forearm. We'll find our own table if we have to. Besides, there are plenty of other things here to distract us. Like dessert, Tabitha retorted and lifted an eyebrow. Exactly, Sybil said dreamily. And I believe I also smell a roast pig and a big bowl of fruit pudding. At least meet my parents, Tabitha insisted. We followed the shapely blonde through the crowd, and I noticed she used her elbows on more than one occasion to clear a path. But her smile took the sting from her actions, and we soon found ourselves at the Blueclaw table, where we found Tabitha's father at the place of honor, dressed in his heavily decorated armor and an electric blue velvet cap that was the exact same shade as Tabitha's outfit. As we made our way over, he looked over for a split second and then back again. When Tabitha waved at him, his eyes immediately lit up, and he stood up slowly and held out his great big arms. Daddy, the noblewoman cried as she skipped around to his side of the table. She launched herself into his arms, and I couldn't get over their size difference. Still, when they parted, I saw how similar they looked. He also had thick blonde hair and kind brown eyes. My girl, he laughed heartily. You've put kohl on your eyes. I like how it looks, Tabitha replied and shrugged. I think it makes me look dramatic. Well, I don't think there's anything in the world that'll make you more dramatic than you already are, sweetheart. He laughed, and Tabitha blushed. Miss Blueclaw, Greyback bowed his head at Tabitha before turning to Sybil. And me. And Hank and Miss Sybil too. What a sight for sore eyes. Thanks, Greyback, I smiled. It's great to see you. Henry, Blueclaw gave me a pat on the back that was so forceful it almost sent me flying. Good to see you're taking such great care of my girl. I've never seen her so happy in my life. You should have met her when she was 16, a complete and utter pain in our Daddy, Tabitha hissed. We don't always need to talk about what I was like as a teenager. She turned bright pink, and Sybil and I shot a look at each other. We were both trying to stifle our laughs, but it was almost impossible as the old knight rolled his eyes. I knew it was embarrassing, but hey, that's what family was for sometimes. Oh, darling, don't fret. An unfamiliar voice next to me chided. I swirled around, and a kind-looking woman with strawberry blonde hair, plump red cheeks, and hazel eyes gave me a polite nod and then made her way to Tabitha. Mother, Tabitha laughed. You look well. Mrs. Blueclaw practically floated her way to the other side of the table and gave Tabitha a big hug. You must be the Henry that is making our daughter so happy, the older woman said matter-of-factly and sat down. That's me, I agreed. And this is our friend, Sybil of Stock. Pleased to meet you, I'm Sybil of Stock, Sybil said and bowed her head politely. A pleasure, Mrs. Blueclaw replied with a pleasant smile. Please join our table. Tabitha sat down next to her mother, and the two noblewomen quickly started to talk quietly to each other. The pair giggled as well, and I assumed they were exchanging the latest court gossip. I found myself seated between Sybil and Greyback, across from the Blueclaws. Other Blueclaw family members drifted by to say hello or whisper in Blueclaw's ear, though it didn't appear that any of the various cousins, aunts, and uncles would sit at our table. Hector and his mother should be here soon, Greyback murmured a few minutes later, though he didn't sound certain that they would appear. They'll be here, Blueclaw replied. It's an important rite. They won't miss it. Greyback sighed, and though he chatted with Blueclaw, he kept glancing toward the door. Finally, when the squires were about to close the doors, Hector and a tall, middle-aged, red-headed woman strolled inside. The first thing I noticed was that Hector had chopped his sandy hair so that he had ridiculously long bangs that flopped over his face, while the sides and back had been cut military short. The next thing I noticed was that he was wearing a navy blue tunic, navy blue pants, and chainmail, but no armor. Why isn't he in armor? Sybil leaned in and whispered to me. Who knows? I whispered back. I don't even know if he's been going on quests. Hector and his mother barely acknowledged the other people at the table before they sat down. Hector dragged an empty chair from another table and squeezed in next to his father's other side while his mother sat down next to Mrs. Blueclaw. Evening. Hector addressed the table in his grating adenoidal voice. What a splendid occasion this is. Oh, but Henry, has anyone explained this to you? Charles and Tabitha filled me in, I replied. Evening, Hector, Blueclaw cut in. Glad to see you could make it for this splendid occasion. Even Greyback had to stifle a laugh. Hector pretended not to notice and turned his attention to his favorite punching bag, me. And it looks like we even have our very own bean knight at the table, Hector snorted. Yes, I answered politely. My beans have certainly been treating me well. Have you completed your night quest, Hector? How is that going? Hector shot me a dirty look before his mother interrupted. You must be Henry, she said in a similarly nasal but far more kind voice. We've heard excellent reports of your farming and of the quality of life on your estate. Seems like there's a great deal of innovation going on over there. Oh yes, Sybil said. There are so many new methods of farming and building that we're trying on the estate. We're all very proud. Ah, Mrs. Greyback murmured as she eyed Sybil up and down and then nodded politely. I could sense an air of shock that a peasant had been allowed to enter the royal banquet hall like this, but it was very subtle and completely dissimilar to Hector's nauseatingly entitled approach. Everything is going well, I trust, Olivia? Mrs. Blueclaw asked the newcomer. Oh yes, Olivia replied. Well, as you know, Hector is. But she was interrupted by the sound of not only one, but at least 10 different trumpets ringing from all sides of the room. I looked around and saw numerous squires holding up long shining trumpets. Each trumpet had a blue and silver banner that hung from the brass tube and swayed with each note. When the trumpets finished their flourish, the court was quiet. There was anticipation in the air, though no one moved until we all heard footsteps approaching from behind the tapestry. I watched as everyone in the room turned toward the throne, and a moment later, the king stepped onto the dais and posed for his nobles. He looked like a total rock star. He was dressed in an electric blue long-sleeved tunic with wide-legged, matching trousers and black boots. On top of this, he wore an embroidered vest that had a black base and swirling silver patterns sewn into the fabric. There were also flashes of light, and on anyone else I might have thought it was sequins. But I'd been in Lupercalia long enough to know that the vest was probably covered in pearls and jewels. But the centerpiece of the whole look was a billowing blue-silver cape that matched the rest of the fabric that had been draped around the royal banquet hall. He held his arms out in front of him with his palms facing up, and the cape somehow rippled in the windless banquet hall. The ground started to rumble in response as the nobles pounded their feet against the floor. The noise grew louder and louder, and I could feel the floor tremble beneath my feet. The king let the adulation continue until it was at a fevered pitch, and then he lifted his arms over his hand and looked toward the ceiling. The nobles started to clap and whoop even as the stomping reached a fevered pitch. Old Greyback was clapping so hard that I thought his hands would start bleeding, and Tabitha started to actually howl. Holy crap, Sybil muttered as she fell back on what was quickly becoming one of her favorite phrases she'd learned from me. I tried to respond, but the place was so loud that my entire body was vibrating, and I could barely hear myself think over the hysteria of the eager banquet hall. I had nothing to compare it to, and all I could do was shrug at Sybil as we watched the insanity. Then in a flash the king dropped his arms, and all of the noise ceased just as quickly as it had begun. Whoa, I'd been to playoff games at MetLife Stadium and even a Bruce Springsteen Stadium show in Jersey City, but it was nothing compared to what I just witnessed. I felt like I was being whipped into some kind of frenzy, and I kinda liked it. Welcome, Lupercalians, the king bellowed, and his authoritative voice echoed off of the walls. The entire crowd started to clap and whoop again before the king raised his hands like a kindergarten teacher to quiet them down. As ordained by the moon goddess, he announced, I, the ruler of the kingdom, am hereby obligated to return to Lake Wahaya to perform the sacred ceremony and receive the goddess' blessing on behalf of all the people of Lupercalia. I was ready to join the clapping and foot-stomping I was sure would follow this statement, but to my surprise, the gathered nobles started to hum. Instead, I looked over at Sybil, who looked back at me and shrugged. At least, I wasn't the only one who had no idea what was happening. The hum became a low drone that reverberated all the way through the dining hall. The billowing fabric began to ripple, and I felt like I was part of some kind of collective magic. I began to hum as well, and after a minute or so, the noise just instinctively died down. I looked over at the throne, but the king was already sitting at his table. Whatever the hell had just happened was apparently done, and I felt a twinge of disappointment that there wasn't more. But that feeling quickly vanished when an amazing smell hit my nose. I looked over, and squires were pushing out giant cauldrons of something that smelled heavenly. They were followed by more squires, who were carting around wheel trays with white bowls and spoons. "What's this?" I asked. "It's an eternal stew," Tabitha explained. "Eh, what?" I asked, and Hector sneered at me and then turned to talk to his mother. "Oh, I know all about this," Sybil said. "An eternal stew is a broth that has been boiling for a long period of time, and whenever it depletes they add more stock and more ingredients to it." "Exactly," Tabitha said to me and grinned mischievously. "So what we're eating now might have remnants of something that our ancestors ate hundreds of years ago." Wait, was I about to eat 400-year-old soup? My stomach dropped. This method sounded like a surefire method for contracting food poisoning. I stared back at Tabitha blankly before she and her mother broke into a fit of giggles. "I see," I smiled. "You're pulling my leg, aren't you?" "Of course I am," Tabitha snickered. "But you should have seen the look on your face." I joined the laughter, in part because I'd been gullible enough to believe Sybil's tale, and largely because I was so relieved that I didn't have to eat moldy stew. "Well," Tabitha's mother said, "we're actually only half joking. When this tradition started, it was far more commonplace for there to be an eternal stew simmering in the palace kitchen. But as the legend goes, one day the cook found the perfect combination. He trawled through every ingredient that had ever been through the stew, and every amount too." "That sounds pretty alchemical," Sybil replied eagerly. "It truly is," Mrs. Blueclaw responded. "He found the perfect combination, and the palace kitchen has been serving that concoction ever since as part of the annual tradition." And just like that, a big bowl of soup with dumplings, leeks, and big bubbles of fat on the surface was placed before me. The smell was absolutely heavenly. "It's a very hearty dish," Tabitha added, "because it's usually eaten before the nobility journey to the lake. I mean, only the king goes to the lake itself, but most of the families follow him as far as the nearby village. The stew is supposed to provide enough sustenance to ensure that everyone arrives happy and satisfied." I took a sip of the soup, which was one of the most comforting things I'd ever eaten in my life. "This is so good," Sybil said between slurps. "You said there's a recipe for this?" "Top secret, unfortunately," Greyback winked. "The chefs here never share their recipes." "It's a shame," Mrs. Blueclaw nodded and took a dainty sip of the soup. "If I could break into that kitchen to get those recipes, I would." "Nonsense," Blueclaw laughed. "You can't even boil an egg, my biscuit." The strawberry blonde shot a mischievous look at her husband, and Tabitha rolled her eyes. "Ugh," Tabitha moaned in the most adolescent voice possible before she winked at me. Blueclaw let out a hearty laugh and patted Tabitha on the back. "We've been making this journey for years," Blueclaw said. "The king receives a special annual blessing from the moon goddess in Lake Wahaya. Powerful blessing will ensure a large harvest, a contented population, and victory over our enemies." "That's some blessing," I said as I remembered the mysterious woman who had given me the ring that brought me to Lupercalia. "But the moon goddess is certainly powerful enough to do all that. So what, everyone just follows the king to this lake?" "Yes, basically," Blueclaw agreed. "The king has private quarters, of course, where he can prepare himself for the ceremony. The rest of the nobles, well, party," Tabitha supplied. "We eat, drink, and engage in merriment for a good 5 days." "Sounds like a great time," I said and slurped down the last of my soup. On cue, the army of squires reappeared to collect our empty bowls and spoons. The soup bowls were replaced with small steaming bowls of rice pudding and what looked like dark syrup with berries. "My favorite," Blueclaw declared as he inhaled the aroma. "Blackberry syrup is a specialty in the palace. Another one of their secret recipes. Unfortunately, we have a special family recipe that's been passed down for years as well." Sybil said as she tasted the syrup. And I think ours is better. Blueclaw's eyes lit up, and Tabitha started to laugh. You should have told him that, the blonde warned. Now he's going to be on the estate every day requesting blackberry syrup. Hush now, Blueclaw said. It's an even better reason to visit my favorite and only child on her knight's estate. I'll make sure to have some ready next time you come around, Sybil replied. With a smile. We lapped up our bowls of pudding and waited as the squires whisked away. Another set of empty bowls. We worked our way through a fish course, a meat course, and finally dessert, all of which was delicious. The meal was surprisingly old-fashioned, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. And by this point I was full as hell. What a feast, Greyback said and lifted a napkin to his mouth. Are there any more festivities? I asked. Not tonight, he sighed. Just the task of digesting all this rich fare. I looked over at Hector, who was leaning on his mother's shoulder in a kind of food coma. What about you, Sybil? I asked and turned to my right. Feeling full. More than ever, she said. But that was a great feast. I can't wait for the voyage to Lake Wahaya. I've heard it's a beautiful place, but I've never had the chance to go there before. I'm sure you'll enjoy it, Blueclaw sighed. Well now, my pup, your mother and I should be heading back to our quarters now. We're not as energetic as we used to be, and we need to preserve some energy for the trek ahead. Of course, Dad. Tabitha smiled and gave her dad a kiss on the cheek. Mrs. Blueclaw leaned into Tabitha and whispered something in her ear. The two broke into a fit of giggles before the elder Blueclaws stood up and excused themselves from the table. It was a pleasure to meet both of you officially, Mrs. Blueclaw addressed Sybil and I. I'm sure we will be visiting the estate very soon, and of course if there's blackberry syrup in the cards, maybe even sooner than you think. We'll be sure to have some on hand, I laughed. The girls and I stayed behind, but it wasn't because I felt the need to party. Honestly, by that point I felt like I'd swallowed a rock. The heat from the torches didn't help either, and the comforting sound of quiet chatter put me in a daze. It was only a matter of time before I fell asleep at the table. I feel like I've eaten a horse, Tabitha sighed. Agreed, Sybil said. We should get going before we pass out. If only I still had my knight's quarters in the palace, I laughed. We'd only have to travel down a flight of stairs. Don't be silly, Tabitha smiled as she pushed her chair in. Where we're headed is far better. Though I'm sure if you did pass out, the squires would be more than happy to put you up in one of the spare rooms. They always keep some ready for unexpected guests. You're right, I sighed. We should head back. We have a lot to do tomorrow. And I'd like to get an early start. And I need to check on some of my night-blooming flowers, Sybil added and then yawned. Greyback, I addressed the old knight. It's been a pleasure to see you as always. You too, my boy, he smiled. I think I'm going to leave Hector and his mother and go reminisce with some old friends. But I'll see you at the lake. Definitely, I agreed. I wouldn't want to miss out on the fun. It took a couple of tries, but the three of us finally made it to our feet and started to wade through the nobles. The crowd had started to thin out, though. I spotted a few who looked like they'd passed out already. The squires were moving quietly through the room to collect the last cups and dishes, though I also saw them do a quick check on anyone who looked like they'd need a room for the night. I'm so full, Sybil mumbled as we started down the stairs. You're always so full, Tabitha replied. And yet you never put on any. Wait, I don't understand how that's possible unless you have some potion you haven't shared with me. It's just as much of a mystery to me as it is to you, Sybil said. Tabitha looked like she didn't quite believe the witch, but we made it to the bottom of the stairs without further commentary. There was a chill in the air as we stepped into the courtyard, and I stopped to take a deep breath. It was late and clouds hid the moon and stars. It would be a dark ride home, and I just hoped Casanova was up to the task. There was an informal line near the drawbridge for nobles who were returning to their properties. Squires rushed back and forth with the appropriate direwolves, and the girls and I loitered nearby until the same unfamiliar squire appeared with Casanova. Actually, Casanova's dark fur blended so well with the night sky that the only thing I really saw were his glowing eyes and the flicker of torchlight reflected against his bridle. It was impressive, and I made a mental note to add sneak attack training to Casanova's skills. That's our ride, I said as I nudged the girls forward. I accepted the reins from the squire, But unlike us, the puppy was full of energy. I could tell he wanted to run, but the middle of a courtyard packed with nobles didn't seem like a good place to do that. So I tugged him toward the drawbridge and waited to mount until we were clear of most of the traffic. All right, girls, I said once everyone was in place. Try not to puke. We'll be just fine, Tabitha said. Won't we, Sybil? Of course, the witch said, though she sounded like she only half believed herself. I'm sure we will be just fine. I nudged the pup forward, and he immediately bolted across the bridge and down the road. Not gonna be sick, Sybil panted. At first, Casanova's gait was shaky, like a car threading its way through a parking lot full of speed bumps. He'd run smoothly for a bit and then he'd suddenly leap forward or to the side. A quick tug on the reins would usually remind him where he was supposed to be going, but then he'd find something else that would distract him. The only thing that seemed to keep him on track was speed, so I finally let him have his head and just hung on. The black pup started to run so fast that the world became a black streak, and the only sign of life was the wind that blew against my face and the sound of Tabitha breathing in my ear. Woohoo! Tabitha yelled. Now we're talking. The torches from the estate seemed to materialize out of nothing, and the vague outline of the manor house appeared a moment later. Casanova was still running at top speed as the scent of moonbeams hit my nose, and I started to pull hard on the reins in some vague hope that we would stop before the crazy pup crashed headfirst into the gate. To my surprise, Casanova actually responded, and he slammed to a stop just short of the wall. Best of all, we managed to stay on his back. That actually worked, I said in surprise. He's doing just fine, Tabitha laughed. I let the girls slide off first before I hopped down as well. I scratched Casanova behind the ears, and the pup lowered his head to make sure I hit all his favorite spots. Nice job, I whispered in the pup's ears. He looked up at me with his big, green eyes and panted happily. He turned his head back and forth under my palm in order to demand a few more scratches. Silly puppy, Sybil laughed. I hope he was just as well fed as we were. Oh, don't worry, Tabitha replied. They give those direwolves the royal standard of treatment on feast days. I wouldn't be surprised if he was eating even better than we were. I unlocked the gate and ushered everyone inside. As I relocked the gate, I took another deep breath and smiled at the smell of coffee beans. Inside the wall, the scent seemed concentrated, and it always reminded me of just how amazing my life was. Moonbeams, money, however I described it, I loved it. And I wanted more. I wish that Casanova still slept inside, Sybil said as we headed toward the house. I know, Tabitha agreed. But after the kitchen incident, it was obvious it was time for him to move to the barn. Yeah, Sybil sighed. I know. If anyone ever used the phrase, bull in a china shop around me again, I knew that I would have to counter with direwolf in an open-fire kitchen. The servants were cleaning up for a week after Casanova had spent only 5 minutes chasing an ember that he'd knocked out of the fireplace. As we approached the estate, I felt a slight chill go down my spine. The night wasn't necessarily cold, but I felt the hairs on my body standing on edge. Nonetheless, maybe it was just the darkness. I didn't often walk around the grounds when it was pitch black unless there was a harvest underway, and then there were always tons of other people around. As we approached the door, Sybil took Casanova's reins. Sit, she instructed the pup, and he obediently sat down. The witch removed his harness, and once she'd pulled it off his head, he ran away behind the house to sleep in the small barn that had been built just for him. Good night to you too, Casanova, Tabitha called after the nearly invisible shape. I grasped the handle to the door but paused. That feeling that we weren't alone was back, and while it was certainly possible that one of the servants was still up and about, this felt different. Hank, Sybil asked, is everything okay? Do you want some more peppermint? No, I said as I furrowed my brow. I just got this weird feeling that we're not alone. You're never alone on an estate, Tabitha remarked. Yeah, maybe that's it, I said. I pushed down on the handle, and another chill swept up my arm. Something was definitely wrong, either with me or the estate. My instinct was telling me that it was the estate, and I knew that I had to move quickly if I wanted to stop, well, whatever the hell was happening. So I threw the door open and lunged inside. Took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the candlelight in the hall, but I quickly picked out what was wrong with the scene. There was a shadowy figure near the staircase, and it had the notebook in its hands.